As somebody pointed out last time, there isn't much about Christopher Lasch on the internet, especially video, and I'd like to change that. I've already done a playlist on his book, The Revolt of the Elites, and this is going to be on his book, The Culture of Narcissism, which I think is pretty much extremely a valuable reading at the moment. I did want to just say a few words about who Christopher Lasch was. He was a historian at the University of Rochester, and these are four of his most famous books. The Revolt of the Elites, which was the last book that he wrote before he died, that was published before he died. Haven in a Heartless World. It's about the family besieged. The True and Only Heaven, Progress and its Critics. And the earliest one, The Agony of the American Left. Lasch wrote more books than that, and I would encourage everybody to check out the full list. He died of cancer, and this is one of the things that he said to his doctors when they urged him to do another round of chemotherapy. And he refused because he wanted to live out the rest of his days, however many he had, being able to write and to visit with people and to be with his family without feeling sick. And he said, "I despise the cowardly clinging to life purely for the sake of life that seems so deeply ingrained in the American temperament." So even to the end, Christopher Lasch was not only really classy and self-possessed, but he was also still thinking about the dilemma of America. Christopher Lasch was an original. I like him particularly because he was not afraid to tell the truth even when it went against ideological orthodoxy. He combined the best of conservative analysis with working class leftism, including a penetrating critique of consumer capitalism, technocracy, and the rule of experts, or what we now refer to as managerialism. He wasn't afraid to look at both government malfeasance and corporate power and influence. He sorted out information without ideological strictures, and therefore he more or less was able to tell the truth, especially if you take into account the times in which he lived. This particular book, The Culture of Narcissism, was published in 1979. And in it and his other books, he uses plain language, which is also very much appreciated. So a little bit about narcissism. Everybody kind of knows about narcissism as it's referred to in the popular culture. Lasch in this book does get into psychology quite a bit. Like I indicated last time, I'm not going to dwell on all the depths of his psychological analysis. He particularly draws from Freud. Instead, I think what's valuable is just the bigger takeaways. Narcissism is named after Narcissus, who famously died in Greek mythology because he just couldn't get away from his own reflection in a pool of water. He fell in love with himself, basically. Incurvatus in se means turned inward. And narcissism, generally speaking, is human beings turning inward. When we turn inward, we see other people and the world primarily as reflections of ourselves, rather than really seeing them and being able to see then what's actually going on around us. The world becomes colored by ourselves, and we see what we want to see. It's marked by an unwillingness to sacrifice personal autonomy to cooperate with or help others. Okay? It's me, my supposed independence, and freedom that are paramount. It overestimates the importance of our yammering mouths, but I'm sure that you have all run up against the yammering mouth, and maybe you've been one. I think we all have been, but hopefully many of us have tried to restrain ourselves. The yammering mouth thinks that it's great and actually political action to go out and post a big screed on Facebook or Instagram, which amounts to absolutely no effect whatsoever, except to maybe make a few people more pissed off than they already were. Anyway, We fall in love with our yammering mouths and our superficial opinions, which we cling to with a religious fervor that defies all logic. This is narcissism. Now, Lasch reminds us that, the 60s movement originally was an idea, it was a social movement, an idea that, people could make progress if they rejected war, if they rejected violence, if they could do that collectively. There was a strong, Jesus movement component where a rethinking of Christianity occurred and placed on action. And then when that kind of fizzled, especially after the Vietnam War, there was a turning inward. The hippies, the 60s generation, a lot of them turned towards kind of inner self-exploration. And, drugs was a part of that. New Age religiosity, New Age like superstition was a part of that. Therapy, meditation, those things were a part of that. And Christopher Lasch reminds us a lot of this was just navel gazing. It was a retreat from any sort of sense of social duty, a turning inward in a selfish way in which my self-development and my personal experience really was paramount. I would say that their legacy today are the religious right, for instance, social justice warriors, autonomous spiritual guru wannabes. Okay, now I know we're not used to lumping these types of characters together, but they all have in common that a lot of them are yammering mouths, right, who go about preaching and telling other people how they ought to live their lives, but do they actually go and do stuff themselves? In other words, do they practice what they preach? Lots of times, no. And that's how you know you've got a similar character to what Christopher Lasch is talking about. Okay, here's a quote from chapter 1, and I'm just going to draw from chapter 1 today because it sets the stage. So he says, storm warnings, portents, hints of catastrophe haunt our times. The sense of an ending, which has given shape to so much of 20th century literature, now pervades the popular imagination as well. The Nazi Holocaust, the threat of nuclear annihilation, the depletion of natural resources, well-founded predictions of ecological disaster have fulfilled poetic prophecy, giving concrete historical substance to the nightmare or death wish that avant-garde artists were the first to express. Now we can add the catastrophe of the pandemic as well, right? And our reaction to it, which is probably more of a catastrophe. And we see the narcissism in our fighting back and forth about whether masks are a good idea or whether hydrochloroquine, whatever, you know what I'm talking about, is a good idea. And falling out on partisan lines about health issues and social responsibility. It is, as I've mentioned before, I think in the interview with Jacob, a death wish. There's a strong death cult that has pervaded our culture. And it's tied up with narcissism, right? The turning inward ultimately is the cancellation of life because you're not concerned with life. And, Lasch is saying here, all of these various, disasters have led to this sense that we're in an apocalyptic time, that something is deeply not right, okay? And I would say that now we are seeing yet another major disaster that is partly natural, but it's largely man-made. He says, after the political turmoil of the 60s, Americans have retreated to purely personal preoccupations, having no hope of improving their lives in any of the ways that matter, and that would be tied to the apocalyptic events and the effect that they had on people. People have convinced themselves that what matters is the psychic self improvement, psychic self-improvement, getting in touch with their feelings, eating health food, taking lessons. Okay. Um, we haven't changed that much, right? It's 2020 now, but we're still doing the same sort of things. Um, he says it is the waning of the sense of historical time, already endangered by the American break from the old world, in particular, the erosion of any strong concern for posterity, that distinguishes the spiritual crisis of the 70s from earlier outbreaks of millenarian religion. So it's a type of religion, but it's a narcissistic type of religion. And his reference to the waning of a sense of historical time really rang a bell. Actually, both of these quotes resonate with Mark Fisher and the book Capitalist Realism, which makes a big deal out of how we just kind of keep repeating the same thing over and over again on a treadmill when it comes to the tropes of our popular culture, right? But here we can see that we're still doing the same sort of thing over and over again. We're looking somewhere outside of ourselves, but really not, right? We purchase or consume things outside of ourselves to supposedly work on our inner selves, and we dwell there. Also setting the stage in this chapter, he turns his eye towards the economy and how the economy works to stop us from having any sort of meaningful private life. Meaningful private life is something that he would distinguish from this narcissism of turning totally in towards the self. Meaningful private life would include having meaningful family life, an extended family life, taking part in the life of the community around you, doing things. And he points his arrows at the rising tendency to rely upon the experts, the technocracy, and how it's getting into every nook and cranny of people's lives. He says the integrating tendencies of modern industrial society have at the same time undermined his isolation, in quotes, because it's not possible to really have private life in the truest sense. Having surrendered most of his technical skills to the corporation, he can no longer provide for his material needs. As the family loses not only its productive functions, but many of its reproductive functions as well, men and women no longer manage to even raise their children without the help of certified experts. The atrophy of older traditions of self-help has eroded everyday competence in one area after another and has made the individual dependent on the state, the corporation, and other bureaucracies. What he means by the reproductive functions is not only something simple like, Dr. Spock, although that's a decent example, Dr. Spock telling you how to raise your child, right? Or, the over-reliance on child care and earlier childhood education rather than raising one's children at home as best one can. But he's also talking about everything that is needed to reproduce ourselves. So what he's saying is that we've reached a point where mostly we don't, in our own home or environs, have the ability to do the things necessary to feed ourselves, to clothe ourselves. Okay. Now, this has, been a boon to the economy and to a certain type of human freedom. When we aren't, doing our backyard gardening or our community gardening or like some sort of arrangement that supplements our diet, right? Or when we stop sewing clothes, which happened a long time ago. Stop preserving, stop doing this and that. It was a great boon in the sense that we had more time, right, to devote to our personal desires and pursuits. But one of the drawbacks of all this is that we shifted our work from doing these reproductive functions more at home and in our local community with basically working in our jobs in some sort of specialized job, whether it's working a cash register or a computer or teaching classes or whatever it may be. We have to work longer and harder in order to obtain these wonderful things that we no longer make at home. Part of the problem with this is a lack of sense of independence. Okay, so at the same time that we're more individualistic in his view, we are also much more collective, but not in a good way. Okay, we are collectively dependent and becoming highly influenced by both the state and its management of people, and also the corporation and its management of people. In its massaging of our wants and desires, in our employment and the routinization and specialization that efficiency engenders, all of that. So he's raising a really big point that needs to be unpacked further. Okay, but here he talks about how, you know, this, as a society of narcissists, who supposedly, you know, whose prime desire is to discover themselves and to express themselves and to have others recognize themselves as who they are, we are at the same time, via government and corporate power, which he kind of sees, they have a similar effect. Okay, so that one could even argue that Lasch sees corporate power as a type of governance. We're used to making a distinction, but maybe it's a distinction without as much difference as we want to imagine. So these influences, government, corporate power, and the regimentation, as they get bigger and bigger and more pervasive, massifies people, meaning that, you know, though we are a nation of navel gazers, perhaps, we also are becoming much and more just cogs in a big machine, okay? We turn towards therapy in a variety of forms to try to deal with the fact of this contradiction, that we want to find meaning, we're looking for it in ourselves rather than looking for it outward. We're not finding it there either, because what we're finding instead is this hollow pit that is consuming the therapy. Now, when Lasch talks about therapy, he can be talking about actual go to a therapist, talk to the therapist, you know, about all your problems. But that is not the worst type of therapy. Okay, the therapy extends to, and the much more pervasive therapy is retail therapy. Okay, in its various forms, right? So we seek comfort in things like Coca-Cola and stiletto heels and dance class, yoga class, right? We have become a nation of therapeutic consumers. And of course, the corporations that produce things would love us to remain that way. So this engagement in therapy, meaning largely retail, what we would call retail therapy now, right? Consuming these things that supposedly are going to make us feel better, actually replaces, he says, individual achievement and religion. It becomes our religion, right? And we pursue it with the zeal of somebody who has that. You know, for the religious person, it's the God-shaped hole that you fill with God, right? So we're filling that with these things too. And we have to keep coming back for more. Lasch says it hardly occurs to them, nor is there any reason why it should, given the nature of the therapeutic enterprise, to encourage the subject to subordinate his needs and interests to others, to someone or some cause or tradition outside of himself. Love as self-sacrifice or self-abasement, meaning as submission to a higher loyalty, these sublimations strike the therapeutic sensibility as intolerably oppressive. Now, these are the very things that give life meaning, okay? Sublimation, meaning deciding that your individual pursuit of your meaning is not as important as others, and you want to maintain your attachments to them. So you put your own kind of idiosyncratic desires for self-fulfillment aside, and you love and sacrifice for others. We know this is what actually makes people happy, which again leads me to believe that in as much as we continue to pursue these other things, whether it's the yammering mouth, which makes us feel very momentarily better, with our ideological screeds, or, it's buying the Coca-Cola or the latest album or whatever it is, the clothes. It's a kind of death cult. Again, we have become possessed by exactly those things which destroy our happiness. And Christopher Lasch does a great job of exposing that. Now, back in the 1970s, we had the women's movement. And the women's movement is not a bad thing in and of itself, but to the extent that it was about women just finding themselves and kind of asserting their right to do whatever they wanted, it wasn't necessarily the best movement in the world. It took many forms, and some of the outcomes were good. But, at some point, for a lot of women, the women's movement became kind of a point of self-assertion, right? I am me, I am woman, hear me roar. I as a child, lived through those times, and I can tell you that for a lot of women who kind of loosely identified with the feminist movement, most of it was about, pushing back against their husbands to receive recognition as an equal person. Again, that's not bad in and of itself, but it stopped there in a lot of cases. And one could say this of many movements, that they tend to stop at that level of individual, demand for respect, recognize me, okay? That should maybe be the very beginning. So Lasch doesn't use that example, but this is what sprang to mind when I read this part of the chapter. He says that the therapeutic movement destroyed private life, including family life, by advising us to invest ourselves not so much in love and friendship, but in ourselves, okay? It preached detachment, independence, and a sort of live for the moment attitude. And these attitudes, he says, destroy personal relations. He says, quote, our society, far from fostering private life at the expense of public life, has made deep and lasting friendships, love affairs, and marriages increasingly difficult to achieve. A social life becomes more and more warlike and barbaric. Personal relations, which ostensibly provide relief from these conditions, take on the character of combat. If the only thing that comes out of your personal involvement with the women's movement is a divorce, then you've missed an opportunity, because personal liberation isn't good enough. People need to think about the liberation of all, right? What is best for all? At a certain point, all such movements tend to be turned into very personalized expression, which then makes easy prey for our economy. For instance, selling women cigarettes, making women feel comfortable in bars where they could drink more. Anyway, hopefully you get my point. Finally, he makes a point about politics towards the end of this, which resonated really deeply, because this is definitely where we're at. Politics in our time degenerates into a struggle not for social change, but for self-realization. That's the point I was trying to make with feminism. If it's just about self-realization, it hasn't gone far enough, and it becomes just another navel-gazing enterprise that corporations can use to sell you stuff. He says we judge politics not by what's in it for me, but is it me? In other words, we've stopped primarily looking at politics in the kind of crass but rather understandable mode of, if I vote for this party, what do I get out of it? You know, do I get some strengthening of protections on my job? Do I get a higher minimum wage? Do I get more law and order? What do I get? Are my taxes lowered? We've gone from that to, which I'm not saying people aren't concerned with at all, but he's got something here. He's captured something that we've gone from that to, this party is who I am, right? It's another vehicle for my self-expression, which then leads to the yammering Facebook screeds, right? Because it's really you out there displaying like a peacock with all your feathers out, who you are. This is why also it's very difficult for people to ever have their minds changed, because they're being come at by arguments that are mainly displays of strutting peacock behavior. And they themselves then strut back. I mean, I'm imagining two peacocks, face to face, chests out, feathers fanned, butting chests, right? That's what a typical political argument is in our society right now. So I'm going to leave you with a clip that many of you are already familiar with, but it's like a train wreck that just, you can't take your eyes off it. So you'll probably watch it if you've gotten this far. And that's of the older people down in the villages in Florida, all of them white as far as I can tell. Trump supporters and anti-Trump people protesting each other. And I just want to ask you, is this a seemly way for our elders to act? Okay, one of the things that Lasch gets into is the importance of not denigrating age, right? That with age comes wisdom, or at least that's the way it used to be. But our society has come so far that older people ride golf carts down little streets in their retirement village with Trump posters, and others stand out on the sidelines basically yelling epithets at them.
Where's your white hood? Where's your white hood? Racist! Yeah, you got it, you! White power! Yeah, there you go, white power. You hear that?
Fuck Trump!
Oh, would you stop the language?
Fuck Trump!
Nasty language.
Oh, listen to your president if you want nasty language, you idiot.
Officer! Get back in your car,
Officer!
she said to me. Get back in your car, asshole. Pick out a woman, dickwad. Yeah, you big boy.
You touch me!
Hey, where's the officer?
Where's the officer? Where's the officer? We don't need fucking Nazi pig! This is what we are! Oh my God! No wonder! Please go!
You'll still be crying on November 3rd.
Oh, no,
Too bad. Too bad. You'll be crying on
You're a Nazi! Beat me up! You can beat me up! You little turd! You fucking turd! Oh, you go! You're a fucking Nazi! Nazi racist pig! That's what you are!
We resemble that. We work and we love it.
Trump, 4 more.
We're the minorities that support Trump. Exactly. They don't come out because they will not vote for him.
Where's your white hood? Where's your white hood? Where's your white hood?